that we connect with many First Nation communities across our vast regional district. And today we're located on the Tecumseh territory, I cannot see, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tecumseh and respect the territory and land on which we gather today for this meeting. Any additions or deletions to the agenda? We do have Mario here. He will be part of the agenda. Anything else? Motion to approve the agenda? Moved by Tricia. Seconded by Mike. All those in favor? Carried. Motion to approve. Any issues with the minutes of the November meeting? No? Good. Motion to accept the minutes? Moved by Tricia. Seconded by Mike. All those in favor? Carried. Okay, we're at our report. Annual audit planning update. I'm assuming this is you, Mario.
Thank you, Chair Bass. So, of course, we're back at that time of year again. I had the opportunity to invite Mario here today to talk to you. We're in an extremely good position right now with the financials, the team, and our readiness for the audit this year, which is a different feeling from last year. And I feel like I know, so much more about everything. So as far as that goes, we've done kind of the interim step with the auditors, and now next week we'll start the audit process with them. So I'm just going to turn it over. There are a couple things this year with our asset retirement obligation and landfill liability that you will see that will kind of give you an insight to what's happening there. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Mario. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, CFO Fox. Good to be back here again today. And we don't have a formal presentation because, as was said, we're ready to roll on the audit. We will be commencing it next week. I signed off on our final planning yesterday, and we had our kickoff meeting for the year-end audit yesterday as well. So we're in good shape from that perspective. But the reason why I still wanted to come here today, it was more to talk about the new asset retirement obligation standard. And we had talked about it back last June when we finalized the audit. But I really want to bring home what's going to change on the financial statements because it is a significant change. And I'm going to talk you through what the standard is now, and you will have questions. But also, we're doing this now so that when we come back in March to present the financial statements, you've had a chance to digest it and have more questions to ask. As once you have the final numbers, I think it will be there because it is a major shift. And so what this standard is, it's a new standard issued by the Public Sector Accounting Board. And what it's requiring is to now, for any assets that you have that are capital in nature, if you have a legal obligation to decommission the asset, we need to determine what that obligation is and set it up on the financial statements and track it. And so if we think about all the discussions about asset management, this is kind of the next evolution now where we go, okay, asset management tells us this is when our assets are going to be retired. This is what it's going to cost to replace. Let's figure out a plan to get there so that we can replace them at the appropriate time. Now, this layers on top of it, what is it going to cost to get rid of the old stuff? And so when we look at some specific items that this is going to impact, let's talk asbestos. It's my favorite one to pick on because we're familiar with the standard. 1989 comes in and the province of BC realizes asbestos is bad if you start poking it. And so now there are procedures and additional costs to remove asbestos, whether you're doing a renovation, whether your building needs to be taken down, and that sort of thing. So this building won't have any asbestos. It's too new for it. But say that in this room there was a bunch of asbestos, management would have to determine what's the cost to remediate it, and we're going to add it to the financial statements. And so if we think about it, we're going to be adding this new liability now, and I'll talk about what the preliminary number is looking like. It's not finalized yet, but it's pretty close. And, it's important because now we're going to have this large new liability on the face of your balance sheet, and you're going to be going, what is this number that we have to pay? And, similar to what you have with landfill liability is getting rolled into this standard. And so, we had the landfill liability sitting on the statements before. It's now going to be part of this new asset retirement obligation line. Same thing though. And so we know that your landfill liability, what's on the statements might not be what the actual, what you funded for it is. It's accounting versus how you budget. There's going to be a difference, but you know, that is where it is. And so when we look at what's going to change on the statements, I'm talking about that we're going to have this new number. And right now it's sitting at about $22.5 million is what the liability initial assessment is at. And so we're going to have a liability of $22.5 million on there. It's not just that that's going to change. The value of your tangible capital assets is going to increase, but also we're going to have a grind to your surplus. And that surplus grind is also what I want to highlight, because if we have a $20 million grind on your surplus of $98 million, that is fairly significant. And sorry, it's 17 million is what the grind will be. But it's important to understand that when we talk about grinding your surplus, I want to go back to when we presented the financial statements back in the spring. Remember when we say there's $98 million in your surplus, there's two parts to it. There's the 58 million that is what's called your invested in capital assets, and then there's the other pieces. The invested in capital assets is not a real number of surplus that you could spend in the traditional manner. And that's the number that's going to be ground down. So while your surplus is going to drop, it's not going to impact, it doesn't impact your reserves, it doesn't impact your current spending. So I just want to kind of taper. Yes, there's some big numbers that are going to be coming into play, but understand it does not impact your true financial position, what you have in your reserves. I know there's been a lot of work on the reserves this year. That doesn't change. And so that's kind of the biggest thing that I want to highlight. And also, we're going to have this new liability, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a funded number. You know, when we look at the different components, obviously the landfill liability is going to be the biggest piece. We do have some facilities with asbestos in it. There are going to be some other items that we can talk about when we present the numbers. And so, you know, we're not necessarily going to be funding all of these, because some of these buildings that have asbestos, we're going to wait till we have to tear them down. At that time, we'll deal with it because it's not a big number. The landfill is going to be one that's going to be a little bit more interesting for you. And so when we look at the landfill liability on your last year's statements, as it was sitting at $5.6 million, it's going to go to $20 million roughly. And it's not that things have changed, it's that the calculation has changed. So before, we'd look at what percentage capacity do you have left in your landfill, and we would calculate what the liability today is based on the cost in the future and what your relative capacity is. Now it's based on how many years until retirement. And so that's been a big change. And we're seeing this across the board, that the landfill liabilities are growing exponentially. And so again, we're coming to you ahead of time to think about this so that when you see the numbers, you can understand it better, knowing that the landfill liability hasn't changed. What you've set aside doesn't need to change. It's just how quickly we recognize the liability changes. And it's the accounting rules that have changed, not what you're doing, not legislation. And so those were really the key items that I wanted to bring up with it, and just open it up for any questions. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, but just wanted to get your initial thoughts on this. And in particular, if there's anything that we can do in terms of other reporting aside from the financial statement that we can do when we come back to present the statements to help you wrap around your heads around what's been done.
Thank you. I take it that what you're presenting to us is not discretionary, or could be dealt with through the notes to reader as opposed to the balance sheet proper.
So what's going to be presented is on the balance sheet is where the numbers will see the changes. There will be disclosures in the notes. This year, there'll be two sets of disclosures. One will be to show here's the impact of the transition, where your numbers were before transition and where they land after transition. And then that will live on the statements for this year. There'll be a second note, which will be the ongoing note. There'll be about a page, page and a half that talks about here's what makes up this $22 million number.
Supplementary to that is this almost is a halfway step to fair value accounting. We're recognizing obligations, but we're really not recognizing the fair value of some of the assets, the replacement costs and that sort of thing. We're dealing with a retirement obligation. Do you have any comment on that? Because isn't that part of the other side of the coin?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, we're still full historical cost in terms of what the cost of the asset to build was. What this is doing now and is basically saying, we know we have an expenditure in the future and we're going to make it be tracked. And to me, the important piece of this is more about, let's not just look at it on the financial statements. This is a tool, another tool in your financial statements that can help operations do future planning when they're doing their asset management planning. And also understanding that with where the province is going with the capital asset reporting, they're also going to be asking for a lot of this information. There's going to be more detailed information in the LGDE reporting coming forward, which is separate, but I'm sure they timed it with the adoption of the standard because they knew that governments would have to be pulling it together. And so now this additional detailed reporting in your LGDE, if you don't complete it and it's not robust, and they will be testing if it's robust, you may not be qualifying after 2025 for any capital money from the province. So it's more about the obligations than the fair value side of it.
So you suggested maybe additional reports to help folks understand this. Can you give us some kind of solution? Because it's going to distract, and it's, is it a real issue? Well, it's a real issue considerably longer than this council term. It is something that has to be addressed at some point, but when people are reading their financial statements, it's going to jump out of them like a sore thumb, and they're going to say, oh my God, we got to deal with this.
Yeah. And I think that, when I look at it, once we're past year one and the big change, and, we look at it, your equity and your tangible capital assets is going to be grounded by around 30% is what it's looking like right now. And so I think understanding how this happened and, if we can give you maybe a bit more details on what makes up that number and what's happened. And then, there's portions that will have been funded, like some of the landfill and that already, and we can kind of have that information. Going forward, I think that when we look at sustainability and everything else, this is the first of many steps of giving readers more information and understanding of where you're at in your journey in terms of asset management and sustainability. And there's going to be more standards coming to it. So going forward, I think that there's going to be just a lot more information there that's going to help people understand it. It's just wrapping our heads around the first big change. And I can work with CFO Fox on what level of detail to provide, and if there's any specific pieces that you want to see, aside from what makes up this number, how it came into be, we can provide all of that and help you understand it. This would be something for a closed meeting, not for a public meeting.
Any questions from the others? No? No? Guess we're good. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else to add, CFO Fox?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bass. So I think since, when was it when they started asking us to account for capital assets in 2010? And it was a real first step by the province to ensure that municipalities, local governments were taking into consideration assets and asset replacement. And then ever since, it's been a big push to ensure that you have proper asset management planning. And then beyond that, it's okay, you can't ignore the future obligation of costs. And sometimes it's the world we live in. Politics does come into play. And by putting it in the standard, it's kind of ensuring that it's something that can't be pushed off. It's in writing. You have to account for it financially, and you have to, in your long-term asset planning, ensure that there's some sort of appropriate savings and reserves being thought about in order for that future replacement of these obligations that we have, and they're not left. Because I think of it's the gas stations, the sites that they have those on, and how that ended up. What are those called?
The greenfields.
The greenfields, and how they were left at one point, and then it had to change because you couldn't just ignore that and walk away from that obligation to make sure the land is remediated. So it's along the same lines with asbestos, and they discover that and make sure that we're taking accountability for those things. So I just see it again as a next step to ensuring that it's in a standard or it's in the legislation so that we have to address it, even though it is far out in the future.
No, and I'll just add to that this is, I alluded to some of the new standards that are going to be coming down the pipe. We don't know what the sustainability reporting is going to be like yet. We've seen it for public companies on the international side. International Public Sector Accounting Board is working on it, and I've had discussions with them. But understand that, you know, when we hear about what's being covered in the media and what society wants us to be looking at, the whole ESG is becoming more than a buzzword. And now the accounting standards are moving to hold organizations, and in particular governments, accountable to those standards and to report what you're doing, and know that there'll also be, as much as we talk about sustainability in the traditional sense, one of the big ones for government is going to be resiliency. I think that everybody in this room can understand why that's important. And, you know, and I'm happy to see that both the province and the standard setters for the accounting rules are looking at resiliency as part of this, which will be separate and distinct from what the public for-profit companies are going to be reporting on.
Okay, Director Grenier.
You'd mentioned that you'd identified 20 million outside of the landfill sites. We already are reporting landfill site obligations in the future. Can you give us some kind of background on how you came about that 20 million?
Okay. So to clarify, the landfill that was recognized before was 5.6 million. We're going to be looking at about 20.7 million will be the new landfill number. And then there'll be 1.48 million roughly that's going to be the additional stuff, which is asbestos, decommissioning of water wells, any tanks in the ground, those types of things. So the landfill is the vast majority of it.
And so we're aware, I guess, of asbestos issues within our assets. Mm-hmm. And we've done an audit, or you've done an audit that says, you know, this building either does or doesn't have asbestos. That tank over there has asbestos. Is that what you've gone through? So we rely, I mean, obviously, there has been a series of meetings with management, and it's not been with finance. Finance has been present, but it's been more with your operations teams and the gathering of information, what studies have been commissioned in the past, looking at your asset inventory, comparing it to insurance documents, looking at ages of buildings and where we would suspect it. And it's that process that was gone through, which was a fairly regimented process, you know, to identify here's what is there. And, you know, I won't speak to, you know, the process here in detail because we're working our way through it, but just to understand the effort. I was working with our Vancouver office for one of the 3 large municipalities in Vancouver. They hired us to do the accounting for it. We had close to 400 hours in doing the accounting and the measurement, and that doesn't count the time of the operations team. So just to give you scope of how much effort is being put into it, and management has put in a lot of time. They've had our consultants come in and work on it to supplement the finance team. But understanding that that's the math, and that's, you know,
creating assumptions, reviewing reports, making sure that there's been enough rigor to get to it. But this has been a large ask of operations to work through as well.
Anybody else? We're good? Thank you. Thank you. Next item. Surplus report. That's you, CFO Fox? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Bass. So after the last meeting that we had and the commitment of staff to work on a new reserve and surplus policy, it was stated at that point that I would not really be able to put a primary focus on that till sometime after March. So we get through the 5-year financial plan, the audit, the year end. So I still am in the thick of all those things, but I have had support. Marnie did a bunch of work for me in legislative services, pulling information together so we could start a general discussion on it. My intent is to try and introduce you to the documents and the process that we look at. I'm not expecting you guys to develop the policy. What I wanted to do is give you guys the opportunity to see what policies contain and talk about some of the things that we might want to see in our policy. One of the attachments, which we'll get to, I kind of favor over the rest. But first off, I think I just want to talk to you about surplus. Surplus just briefly, because I don't have documentation on surplus numbers. It's a little preliminary, because what I'd like to do when I bring that discussion to you is know where our year-end surpluses are at, which we're just finalizing now to work with, I looked over, Mario's not there anymore, to work with Mario in the audit. And I want to be able to show you what our surpluses were historically, what they are now, and over the last year, really finding out how the surpluses here at the TNRD work and why they exist, some of the factors that play into that. One of the, so I'll go to my notes. I won't go off script just yet. So the surplus policy for us is important to help with financial management. It helps with the board understanding what's happening to the surpluses and feeling like they have direction over setting some parameters. There's fiscal responsibility with those parameters to ensure that the departments, the different services are working within their means as far as expenses and revenues. They help prevent the surpluses from being frivolously or without proper planning, ensuring that funds are allocated in a manner that benefits the community. There's transparency and accountability when there's a policy. And my feelings don't have to start, I guess, leading or guiding the decision-making where some of these surpluses are concerned. There's risk management with having it, and it really helps with long-term planning. So historically here at the TNRD, reserves were used less in a lot of cases, and surpluses used to carry over funds, unspent funds from projects a lot of the times. So one of the things that was inhibiting us from properly using the reserves is that there was an understanding that there had to be a reserve bylaw for every reserve that we had. So when I came, we did further investigation with the province, and that isn't actually the case. When you create a bylaw for a reserve, it becomes a statutory reserve, and there's only certain reserves that need to be statutory. So in that work, there's things that we found in the practices that we're doing that could be opened up a little bit differently because we're looking at those things differently. There's more flexibility in a reserve. Certainly, it is nice with a capital reserve to have a policy that guides the spending there. So up to this point, we have had that. The capital being embedded in the operating plan made it a little harder to be transparent because we have large capital projects. And if you don't spend on those capital projects, the money sits there and then it gets carried over from year to year. So they're doing the accounting and acknowledgement of those capital items, but not necessarily is the board seeing a list of all the projects that weren't spent upon. Having this capital plan presented separately, you will see the budget, the amount that's spent, how the funding is funding those capital items completely separate. That removes the surplus being created from the capital. Capital is being funded by intentional transfers to the reserve funds. So on a capital plan, you see the capital expenditure, and then you see donations or grants or reserves that are funding the total amount of the capital. So it keeps it a bit cleaner that way. Chair Bass.
I just want.
You want questions during this, CFO Fox, or after?
Certainly, I'll take a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wonder if you could just repeat that, go a little bit slower so that I can digest what you just said. I think you said that if we got a capital program that's in way, or there's some reserves that are set aside for the capital project, you're going to make a distinction between a departmental surplus and donations or the funding from the capital plan, so we can identify whether it's a surplus or whether, say, it's a grant or a donation towards a capital plan. Is that what you just said?
So I'll say it in a way, and I think you're understanding what I'm saying, but I want to just make sure that we have an income statement per service that shows the revenue and expenses. Right now, it shows operating revenue and operating expenses, and it shows capital revenue and capital expenses. The 5-year plan that I put before you has an operating plan that shows operating revenue and operating expenses, and a capital plan that has capital revenue and capital expenses. So no longer is it showing in a financial statement of operations. So it'll be very easy to see in one of the services what the revenues minus the expenses are to the operating surplus. On the other side, we have capital, and really there's not surplus that happens in capital from my perspective, because you don't use the revenue unless you spend. So if you budget $100,000 for a capital item, you spend $75,000, you only bring in $75,000 worth of revenue to cover it. So 75 minus 75 is 0. There's no surplus, it zeroes out. That's kind of my longer answer to that, but they're treated as separate financial statements. Or right now they're combined. So, and I'm intertwining here the conversation between surplus and reserve because they are connected. Surplus essentially has a few intricacies. One, you should never feel bad that a service brings you a surplus. We don't want to encourage spending to a zero budget, because then they spend the money that they have. They may not need to spend it. So we don't encourage that. You only spend what you need. So if there's a surplus at the end of the year because there were excess revenues, because they found savings, because they didn't need all the expenditures, that's great. What you don't want is year over year, you're not spending what you budget for and it's creating a surplus. I can tell you it's hard in a regional district with these many services to predict that, especially with the bigger, the larger services where the larger surpluses are created. So if you think of that, you budget $500,000 to spend, you spend $300,000, you have a $200,000 surplus. And you're like, wow, my taxpayers are not going to be happy because I just taxed them for $500,000. We only spent $300,000. But what happens is that $200,000, if it costs you $500,000 still to operate the next year, that $200,000 now comes in as your revenue, and you only have to tax $300,000. So they always get it back. So it's not like we take the surplus and do something else with it. The surplus is always coming back into the budget the next year, thus reducing the taxation required to pay for that service. Now, I know this gets a bit complicated. So if you look at this year over year, And year over year, you are generating, let's say in a $500,000 budget, $100,000 worth of surplus every year. The minute I remove that surplus, the budget goes up, taxation. So it's not as easy for me to come in and just say, oh, we're no longer going to get surplus. We're going to spend all our money. We're not going to generate surplus. So there's a bit of a trick. If there's excess funds getting carried over year, we had $100,000 that we didn't spend 5 years ago, and we just keep carrying it forward. We're not spending it, not spending it, not spending it. So from my perspective, if the surplus is staying the same year after year, we've created excess funds in a previous year that's pretty much getting carried forward every year. One way to get rid of that is to take that surplus out and put it in a reserve bucket for that area. That way, that money isn't getting carried over year. And you'd know that because if your expenses are $500,000 and you're spending $400,000 and you have a project cost in there that you're not spending, you can easily see that. Again, it's not quite that easy because most of these services are complicated, like development services, building standards specifically gets a large amount of permit fee revenue. And if the economy is great, they get large excess amounts of revenue, sometimes over budget. That money has been carried over year. Now we've changed that practice. As of last year, we've been trying to take where we see those surpluses just getting carried forward, we're taking them and putting them in that services reserve bucket for future use. And that's great. So that allows us to see then if our expenses year over year are then consistent. And we've kind of committed to, we're trying to keep that surplus to about 10%. But again, I don't want to over encourage staff to say, well, that you got to keep it within that. Spend on what your business needs. If there's an anomaly and you have an excess surplus, we just come and explain it to the board, because I still want to encourage appropriate fiscal responsibility to their spending. I don't want them to think they're going to lose funds because they didn't spend it, and then they just try to force to spend. I've been doing this for a long time. And historically, places, they were managed so strictly to budget line items that then they would dump costs in other budget line items so that they didn't go over in an area. I don't encourage that. That encourages poor fiscal responsibility. Because 1 year you might go over in supplies, as long as overall you don't spend as much in training and your budget comes in, that's how I want the budget managers to manage. So I'm not encouraging them to try to not bring us a surplus, but I am encouraging them to try and predict their expenses as accurately as possible. And in some places that's really easy. They've got a couple lines, we pay a grant and aid, we pay an admin fee, and that's easy. And in some areas it becomes a lot more complicated to do that. So we've got lots of new staff, new finance group. It's taking us time to understand the business. We're peeling out the capital from the operating. I need to learn the trend that's happening. So one thing I'll ask of you is, this isn't a perfect science. We're going to do our best to incorporate into a policy some of the things you would like to see. So for an example, with surplus, we get interest on all our investments. We haven't historically budgeted for interest in the tune that we're getting interest. So if we have a $250,000 budget for interest and we got $1.5 million, we have no policy that says what to do with that excess interest. Right now, it becomes surplus. So if we have a budget of $250,000, say we got $1 million in interest, 750,000 of that is becoming surplus, thus getting carried forward and reducing taxation in the next year without you intentionally deciding that. That's what's happening. So it's not like staff is going and taking the surplus and giving themselves extra money in extra buckets. We don't budget that way. We're going in, we're looking historically at our trends for all our line items. Oh, insurance went up. We need to make sure our insurance costs go up. That's how we go look at our numbers. Operating costs generally aren't shifting that much other than inflation. So if you think of it that way, it's just the one-time projects. You might have a survey or a study you need to do in one area. One time we have an internal audit that's happening. It's a one-time thing every 3 years. So you're going to see a little bit of an increase for that. We're managing budget lines as such. So the operating costs, and this is why I want to be able to have the capital pulled out so that I can show you the trends so that you can see that the fluctuations aren't that great. You can just see this gradual increase, and then we can justify the other ones. But right now, we're generating surplus in areas where we don't have policy guiding decisions. Let's say there's snow clearing and we've budgeted $25,000 in snow clearing. Well, guess what? Up till December, we didn't actually even have to shovel. So we only spent $2,000, right? There's nothing saying that that money that wasn't spent should go into a snow clearing reserve. So it just gets carried forward as surplus, and it reduces the amount of tax you need next year for operations. It's not a bad system. You just have less say into what's happening with the surplus, but you can know that the surplus is going back to your taxpayers, thus reducing taxation. The problem is if you think the expenses are being overly expensed each year, forcing a surplus. But what I can tell you is even if we go and we intentionally reduce the expenses so that surplus isn't there, it's going to have 1 year's effect on the surplus amount. And it's going to increase your taxes because there'll be no more surplus being carried forward. So you do an intentional reduction in 2024 of your expenses. You make sure the taxes, the surplus is decreased. The surplus coming into your revenue is less. So overall, you should think you're going to be flush. And then going forward. So we're trying that in different areas. We're trying to look really detailed at the expenses, bring those numbers down. So that's my Coles Notes version on surplus to give you guys kind of an understanding of the intricacies all playing in here, and it's learning how the business did its practice before and where the surpluses were actually being generated from. So in some cases, it was one time didn't spend it, capital project, and we just carry the money over till we're going to spend it because we weren't using reserves. Well, now we got reserves. We're doing that differently. That should reduce the surplus. Capital is on a separate financial statement now. That should clean that out of the operating, and we won't be generating as high as surpluses from unspent capital costs. When we create a surplus policy, and when I bring that to you, I will look to create parameters where it says when we have excess interest, when we have unplanned revenues, when we have unplanned savings, is there a certain amount or that you would want moved into a reserve? But you got to remember, it's either we do this as a general surplus policy for the TNRD, or you're creating a surplus policy for 124 services. So you're either going to go into the minute detail of each service, and then you have to understand every service and how it operates, or you're going to give staff the parameters that is general, that gives you the comfort that you know the surpluses are being dealt with appropriately. I would suggest that doing a surplus reserve or policy for every service would be a overkill and a lot of work. I would hope that you would feel confident knowing that, okay, if there's interest earned in an area, we want that interest to go to the reserve fund to add to the reserves that created that interest. If you have a surplus that's carried forward in a department that's above $50,000 right now, it gains interest. So planning and development, solid waste, there's a number of different departments that have had larger surpluses. We take all those surpluses that got carried forward and we calculate and allocate interest to every one of those surpluses. We allocated over $300,000 worth of interest this year to departments that had over $50,000 worth of surplus. So that also benefits your constituents because that surplus is getting carried over and reducing the amount of taxation. So if I take that surplus out that was gained on that interest and put it to the reserve, amazing. We put it into the reserve for future capital. But then we don't carry it forward and it doesn't reduce taxes the next year. So one seems really great, works great for future capital. The other way seems great because it reduces immediately taxes. So right now, surpluses gain on, or interest gain on surplus dollars is being kept in the budget, generating more surplus and reducing your taxes in the next year. Interest gain on reserve funds gets transferred directly into the reserve fund. So this year we're showing it transparently. We're going, okay, you earned this much interest on your reserve, but it's going directly into the reserve that it belongs to. So, but as far as I can find, that is a precedent. That's a practice that happens here. And I don't see it written in a policy. I'd like to see that in a policy. Those are the things that I want to bring for you. So I'm going to stop the surplus conversation and open that up for some general questions here because I don't have any further documentation on that.
Questions, anyone? Mike, Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. So I think what you're saying is, yeah, you're moving towards a surplus and reserve policy, that they're valuable tools, that if they're overly restrictive, it fetters the discretion of departments in their operations. So we don't want to make it overly difficult. That there is a track record that you're gaining more information from. So it's a working document that it might have tweaks as it goes along, but there's no question that we need to move to a surplus and reserve policy for transparency. And so that everybody understands that if you're having, for instance, chronic large surpluses, that's drawing attention to the fact that maybe we should look at that particular department. You would agree with that. What you're saying is you don't want to go to a zero budget basis where you're out, you're under the line, and then all of a sudden that creates a crisis that doesn't have to exist. So I don't think that there's any difficulty identifying what is a percentage surplus that we would begin to look at and say, is that a chronic situation? Is that a one-off situation? The second comment that I have is that when you transfer surpluses, if your process is to transfer surpluses to reserves, which I think is what you're saying, that you would like to see anything above that excess goes into a reserve, it makes it easier to invest those funds. We don't have an investment policy defined, and it helps invest those reserve funds because they're in big hunks. They're not, $1,000 over here and $5,000 over there. It's tens and 20,000s because it's sitting in the reserve. It makes it easier to invest. We get a higher interest rate and it's easier to track. So I think that that's the reason why we're looking not just at defining a surplus policy, but what to do with those surpluses and transfer them into the reserves. I think we're totally in line with that concept. And as your time permits, if we can move towards that, then we'll just be more effective for our constituents.
Thank you, Chair. And really probably within my first couple of months of diving into this role, I could see the need for it. But good rule of thumb, and from me doing this previously, as I really had to stop and seek first to understand. So I really am working with my team to understand their businesses, which are 124 different businesses. So as much as, and I want to make sure what I commit to bringing to you, I can actually achieve and do it properly. So I had a lot of energy when I first started to be like, oh, I've got to get into this. So I did bring it to the board and say, these are areas that we need to look into. But I did ask for time to discover, you know, what were the reasons and the practices happening here. From my perspective, it was just a different way of saving. They were still tracking it. It was still responsible. They were still accountable. It just wasn't as transparent as you might like to see it. So I'm going to work to help make it more transparent and then put some defining parameters over things that we are treating as precedent, just things that we're doing year after year that don't really have any guiding document, and make sure that that's what the board wants. So I think we're aligned on that. I still have to manage the time and resources that I have. So I'm bringing you the information as fast as I can pull it together. But like I said, I don't want to overcommit. So my hope is that over the next 4 to 6 months that I have something in front of you that we can certainly adopt prior to getting into the budget season. And then, you know, if we learn from there and grow from there, that's what I hope we could do.
Director Grenier.
CFO Fox, can you tell us how you're currently handling investment of surplus funds? Like, what is the practice right now? And when I look at simple math, I say, all right, if we had, just picking a number, $40 million, and if you were investing $40 million in something, what's the current interest rates? I think our last year's statement said that we earned $700,000 on our surpluses. And if you use the number 5% MFA financing, if you could invest in MFA financing, if it was 40 million of cash, that would be $2 million. So there's a notional difference between 700,000 and $2 million. Our efficiency there is actual dollars. So if you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Okay. Give me 1 sec here. Just did up a bunch of notes on this. So there was not much, from what I could see, dedicated resources to managing investments. When I started, we have a couple different ways that we're doing this. So we have a large investment in MFA. We have kind of a day-to-day investment in our regular bank account, and then we have a high interest savings account. Taking money in and out of MFA is a little bit more difficult. You have to have a certain time frame. So in order to manage day-to-day, we work within a high interest savings account that we have, both gaining very similar amounts of interest. I started just moving money back and forth as we needed a little bit more regularly. And then when I hired the finance manager, I asked her to see to that as well. I do think that has gained us a bit more interest, but there's not an intentional focus. We're just trying to manage that a little smarter with the current resources we have. I did bring in hire a financial analyst, which will be part of his job to help us manage investments in a more intentional way. Right now, I would say I wouldn't call it intentional. And I actually could really make it look really good, because 3 years ago, I think the interest rate was just over, it was like 0.6%. And right now it's over 5%. So in the time that I've been here, we have brought in 500% more interest, but it had really very little to do with me. I want to take the credit. I want to take the credit. I know there's lots of places saying, you know, our investment strategies have brought us all these large returns. So have ours. We just kept the same strategy year after year, and it really wasn't, other than over the last year and a half, there was a little bit more intent about making sure our money was sitting in the interest account and not our general bank account. So I think it was $300,000, then it was $1 million, and now it's over $2 million. So it's gone up 500%. So it's something we're aware of. It's something we are trained to pay attention for. It isn't something municipal governments intend to really focus on unless they're larger municipalities. I was asking one of the ones in the Lower Mainland how much money they had to work with, and it's way more than we have, times 5 or 10. So we had a little giggle over that because we thought, we were doing really well. But I think from my perspective, we are being fiscally responsible. Could we do better? Could I bring you a case that says I could pay for a person probably based on better interest rates? I think I could make a case. But right now I do have a person tagged to that. I would like to get the finance department stable, and then he'll start focusing on that more. I feel like a year and a half of emergency operations has gone on. We've been in the ER and now we're just coming out. And hopefully after March, we're gonna run consistently, and we'll put a bigger focus on that. And then maybe next year I'll be bringing an investment policy to you. But again, I don't want to commit to that because I've got to try and meet the commitments I've already made. But please know that there is intentional understanding and thought that's there, and we've done well. And $2 million has gone back into reserves this year with interest. And $300,000 has gone back to services with interest that carried surplus. Okay.
So just for my education, how many dollars do you have right now in investments? Like, do you track? I have 15 million, 20 million, 40 million. How and what interest rate are you seeing right now? As you pointed out, 3 years ago, it was a fraction of 1. And today it's 5%, and we're not talking risk investments. I'm keeping within the orbit of MFA financing, which is where we borrow from. But we probably should be generating something in the neighborhood of 5.5 over an annual interest rate. And I'm trying to get a sense of how much money we've got in the market at 5.5%, say.
In 21, average was 0.15%. In 22, average was 1.87%. And in 2023, the average was 5.06%. And 24, we're up around the 5.
And the quantum? The total amounts that are actually at work.
Oh, so what I had previously said, so just over 300,000, just over $1 million, and $2.5 million.
Director Stamer, I'm sorry, I didn't see you sitting up there in the middle of the screen. So we'll go to you now, please.
Oh, goodness.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment. I like what Carla had mentioned about the fact that all the staff is going to be doing their utmost to not only be able to maintain their budgets, but to also, save where they can. And I also appreciate the fact that she mentioned the surpluses. And again, as I mentioned in previous meetings, I don't want to find us trying to get it to a finite point to zero, as Ms. Fox has mentioned, and then find ourselves in a deficit situation. The benefit of being able to have a strong grip on what's actually going on and having staff on board is that we do, in that example of the 500,000, only spending 3 and having 200 to carry forward. As a board, we have the flexibility of doing something with that $200,000, whether we apply it to the next year's budget or we can turn around through our policies and use it into a reserve, because maybe all of a sudden now we have an additional requirement in that budget. And instead of having to come up with $200,000 of new money, we have $200,000 of old money, and we can keep our increases either at the same or less. So I appreciate that, and not trying to get super complicated on, we got to be fine tuning everything, because I've been through many budgets, and the cleanliness of theory is no match for the mess of reality. And at the end of things, sometimes you hope that it all works out. But like for ourselves here in Barrier, again, we're going to be under budget. we're also going to be under reserve. And that's troubling to me because we've put money aside for future expenditures. And we all know that those expenditures are going up way higher than we originally planned. So we're still in a good spot, but I'm still not entirely, happy with the way it turned out. Even though we were under budget, we were also under reserve. Thank you.
CFO Fox.
Thank you, Chair Bass. So one of the things when I looked at the interest numbers and I'm like, okay, wow, we're really pumping up the reserves based on the amount that the interest has gone up. One of the things that gave me comfort in knowing that is we have no reserve investment strategy. So we're not intentionally putting money in reserves other than where we've seen we want to move a bit of surplus. The only place we are intentionally doing this really was in solid waste and a bit in planning and development because they need those reserves to kind of balance out the fluctuations in those services. So from my perspective, being able to draw on this to ensure that we are putting that in there, because I've done the 5 and 10-year long-term capital plan that needs to be funded. And a lot of the projects are only on there with grant funding and they can't go ahead without it. So it's important to note that without having an intentional reserve contribution strategy, the interest that gets allocated to the reserves is really helping with that. But it does also only help in the areas that have large amounts of reserves. I mean, it's helping little bits in the other ones. Like if you have a $10,000 reserve and you're putting in a couple $100, that's great. But solid waste, planning and development, library services, all those areas that hold large reserve balances, they're getting a big influx of fund for future capital investment. And I think that's really important, lacking an intentional reserve contribution strategy. So I just thought of that as Director Stamer was.
Director Stamer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Madam Chair. And yeah, I just wanted to add too that, in the past, we didn't rely on, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Madam Chair?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I can't see it on my screen. In the past, we didn't rely on grant funding. I mean, when we did the well system in Barrier 30 years ago, we had to raise the money every dime from the residents here. There was no grant funding available. And over time, that's changed. What I'm afraid of and what I can see coming down the pipe is we're not going to be able to have the same type of grant system that we've had maybe in the last 10 or 15 years. Those 80-20 splits may end up being 50-50 splits. And if we don't have money set aside in some of these areas, specifically for some of these projects that we're planning in our 5 and 10-year plan, we aren't even going to be eligible for those grants, let alone being able to afford them, because we won't have the money necessary, because it may be a 50-50 grant. And right now, if you started right fresh on a 50-50 grant, you wouldn't have enough money in the bank to be able to even apply for it, let alone be successful for it, because your taxpayers wouldn't be able to afford it. So we have to be mindful of that. We certainly don't want to be putting a bunch of money aside with no explicit purpose. And I know that's what Director Grenier's been talking about a lot. But at the same time, we also have to be cognizant if governments start changing their focus and next thing you know, instead of having an 80-20 split, we only get a 50-50 split. We've got the resources necessary in that 5 and 10-year plan that we can go forward with those plans. Thank you.
CFO Fox.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to comment because I think we went to Director Stamer and Director Grenier had asked about the total investments. Right now, there's about $40 million that we are, I should jump back because that's, yeah, it's about $45 million right now. And then by the end of 2024, it's supposed to be about $41 million in different pots that we're managing for different services.
Director Grenier.
So thank you for that. That's really helpful. So if we're sitting there with just quick math, $40 million, generating something in the 5% range, we would anticipate $2 million in interest income this year, if interest rates stay the same and if the $40 million continues at work. Is that a fair comment, or maybe more than 2 million?
Thank you, Chair, through to the board. So yeah, and I didn't, luckily I have just reviewed interest and what was happening there, so I'm able to talk about that right now. But yeah, if you think we have $45 million now, we got $2.5 million worth of interest. When we have $41 million, as long as the interest rates stay the same, we're going to get similar amounts of money. They have in the past here budgeted conservatively, and that was working because when we look back 3 years, the interest wasn't going up to $1 million. So it's not to say that we can't gain a little bit in budgeting, possibly a bit more. But historically, those reserves, a majority of those were being transferred directly to the reserve funds that they were attached to.
Okay, you've got more on your report?
Yeah, thank you. So jumping into the reserves. So again, having a reserve policy, you can, right now we have many capital reserve bylaws. It would be really great, and they all pretty much say the same thing. I can see that in some instances you might have unique circumstances where you would need that. Maybe there's cemetery, parkland, where there's statutory reserves. You need those sorts of things. But for general equipment, capital purchases, it's pretty standard. And when you call it a capital bylaw, if you say we have something deemed a capital bylaw, it has to be deemed capital under the certain standard, and these are the parameters you have to spend within. From my perspective, that works to guide good purchasing. If you agree that a fire department needs a fire truck and it needs to be replaced every year, do you really want to get involved, or would you feel better knowing that we actually have to have a strategy to replace that in the time that it comes up, and we're properly investing money year over year, so when that truck comes up, we either replace it, or we say, because obviously interest rates aren't great right now to borrow, so no one really thinks that's a great investment. So having your own and earning 5% interest is a better investment to pay for future capital right now, rather than trying to borrow at a higher interest rate. So, you have to have an understanding of how you want to purchase. Some places I've been, they leased equipment. Most places that I've been have gone away from leasing equipment and have purchased. So you can get involved to the point where you want to understand if we're going to lease, or when we're going to lease, or when we're going to borrow. Maybe a good parameter to set. Really, I believe limitations in reserve policies, how little you should have or how much you should have, really comes from your asset management planning. And we don't have a really good asset management plan. So the other thing right now is you can look at your amortization and you can say, okay, we should be investing into our reserves for future capital at minimum 2 times the amortization of our current assets. I'd say now with inflation, like with the economy, you could look at least 3 times what your amortization is. So we have ways in the finance world to kind of use reasonable ways to determine what we think a limit should be for how much you're contributing to a reserve, how much minimum amount you want in a reserve. Operating reserves are different. You might want 10% of your operating costs put into an operating budget so that if anything happens, you can address it with tapping into the operating reserve. So there's operating reserves, there's capital reserves, there's special project reserves. I think of the policy that I really like, they have where we've got that growing communities grant. So they created a reserve for that, because essentially under the accounting rules, it's not deemed you have to give it back, just like gas tax. So you can take it and put it in your pot of money and spend it as you need. Although there are parameters around that one. So you could have some special reserves that are created just to manage those larger grant projects. So you want to be able to have reserves set up with parameters that support good long-term planning, capital planning. You want them there to manage risk. So like your snow removal, sometimes you'll have spent $50,000 to a $10,000 budget because the snow year was huge. In other years, you spend $2,000. So I've been places where when a service like that can fluctuate so greatly, they put money in the reserve. So at times it's low, they can take money and put it in the reserve. When times it's high, they can take money out of that reserve and manage that service. That becomes a little harder, I think, with the regional district and having 124 services. Where a municipality, it's all essentially in one bucket. So the only difference being is that we would have a general operating reserve, and then you would have a utilities reserve, because you need to remember that the general operating is funded by taxation, and the utilities fund has to be kept separate. And it is not, there are no taxation dollars generated to pay for utilities other than parcel tax. So when you have a reserve policy, one of the things you might see is a general operating, a general capital, a utilities operating, and a utilities capital. And that is why you would see that, because the funds have to be kept separately and they might have different parameters around them. If I think of the reserve policy, where it could be helpful with utility services, if you think of the troubles that we have with utility services, where we didn't use maybe a total impact analysis to determine, we got a grant to put in a water tower, and we're providing service, but we didn't plan continual year-over-year contributions to make sure we could replace or maintain or keep that service up. So then you run into problems where the service starts to dwindle, or you have problems, or you have to replace things and there's no money there. You're already charging a very high rate for those services, and now you have to charge more if you want to continue. Having an asset management plan that's tied to a reserve policy is really important, so that when you're making those decisions, when decisions like that are coming to the board, that you're taking into consideration future capital costs and funding strategies to your reserve policies. I can only imagine, I've not worked in a place yet that has had a fully functioning asset management plan. Okay, so we're not unusual. As Director Stamer said, all the grants, the province, they're all pushing us to make sure that we're doing this, and we do it at many different levels. And I thought things were complicated enough. And then I come to a regional district where you have to have basically 124 different ones for all the different services you have. So again, I want to encourage you to look through the attachments. So the next conversation I would bring you will look a little bit more detailed at the policy itself, the different pieces that I believe that we should have in there, like the limits, and that I would hope that in special cases, we have a policy for an individual service, but in most circumstances, I'd like a general overarching reserve policy. I think I can accomplish that this year. I think that it won't be perfect because we don't have an asset management plan. We're going to have to use reasonableness in coming up with limits. And I'm hoping that you guys will work with us to review the information that we bring you based on the research that we do in the best practices, and, bring in your unique thoughts to the process, so that when we bring it to the board, that we've taken into consideration as much as we can to make this something that everybody can support and buy into, that feels like it's holding the board, the staff accountable to the constituents for the appropriate use of funds. And I know that there is a layer in there where there's a debate whether using taxpayers' money now to put away for future assets is something you should do. And our earlier conversation with Mario from our auditor, everything the government is doing is pointing you in that direction. They're trying to take away the cyclical, every 4 to 5 years, boards turn over and they make decisions that may benefit that period of time and not think about the long term. And it's important. If I was to do this same work in a business, we would make different decisions, but we shouldn't, because they're making decisions to be accountable for the future costs. We need to do the same, but we have to find a balance for all of you guys where we are taking money from current taxpayers to pay for future costs. And where is that balance for us? So we've got to find that's going to be different for each of you here in this room and for 27 board members, I'm sure, and for us. So we try and use, from my perspective, the best practices provided by CRA, PSAB, Local Government Act, Community Charter, guidance from the auditor. Then they have asset retirement obligation that sets a standard. They have landfill liability. There's lots of different things that guides that. So I'm sure I could talk on and maybe talk you into lull you to sleep maybe. But at this point, because it's very interesting to me, and I think Director Grenier. So I just want to make sure that I stop and give you guys the opportunity to understand what I'm kind of bringing forward.
Questions? Director Grenier? No? Director Stamer, do you have any questions?
Yep.
See, I feel bad for ignoring you. Okay, there are no questions. Oh, yeah, of course there is. Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say I'm excited to hear this progress on it and to put some importance to the whole thing. You've just informed us, of course, that we're earning at the current interest rates roughly $2 million a year on our surpluses. And when I graduated from school, interest rates were in the upper teens. Okay, I was in an environment that was 16, 17, 18% interest rate in the early 80s. So the fact that we're on top of this and are able to coordinate our reserves in a way to maximize value means that we can fund some of these projects that we're sitting around talking about 300,000, 200,000 water utilities. There's a real possibility that we can generate income from reserves and be on top of it. So I'm really excited about the surplus and reserve policy. And I don't know if we at some point move to developing an investment policy, but that would certainly follow a surplus and reserve policy. I know you're working on it, but I think that the sooner we do that, because right now we're earning at the rate of $500,000 a quarter. That's what we're earning right now. Can we earn another $25,000, $30,000 out of that? But that's great news to hear about this. Thank you, Chair.
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So Mario had mentioned the word resiliency, and a bunch of us keep each other informed on what we see happening across the province, across Canada, throughout the world. And right now, this last year, that was the average interest in what we earned. 2 years ago, it was 0. So based on good risk management practices, I'd hate to say we can bank on that. I think we're riding a good wave right now. It's important that we take advantage of the investment into reserves right now, because to borrow money is high. So while we are enjoying interest rates, when we're borrowing for Loon Lake, for Black Pines, for future investment, interest rates are high. So it is great that we invest and we have money put away for fire trucks and the necessary equipment and replacement that we need. I think that's really important to remember. There's good with the bad. The other thing I would say is utilities, which desperately needs the influx of money, has low balances in their reserves. So while we need and could benefit from that, unfortunately, those are areas that have lower amounts in the reserve. So while they're benefiting, they're not benefiting to the tune where solid waste is benefiting. However, solid waste, like other areas within BC, has seen huge increases. And I just want to remind you guys that those increases right now are being subsidized by your reserves, which I typically, that's not something that I would suggest normally, because for the reasons that I know we have huge infrastructure deficits. We need money across the organization in many different areas. And I'm worried about our resiliency. And there's places like Osoyoos, you know, there's other neighboring places that are struggling with having zero reserves. So we have reserves, we're making good investments, let's make calculated moves. And I'm trying to be a bit more conservative. I have a new team, I am new, I want to seek to understand, and I don't want to do and make any decisions now that will harm our constituents in the future. And sometimes when we use reserves to offset taxation, so if you think about it, our operating budget stays the same. Next year it goes up. We take reserves to pay for taxes. Next year that reserve isn't there. Budget went up once, it's gone up twice. So now you've got a double hit to your taxpayer. And I can guarantee you that taxpayer, although you benefited them here, next year when we tell them it's gone up that much, they're not going to care or remember the year before, because I've seen it. I've got the complaints. I've bore the brunt of those, trying to explain those reasons, especially when you're in a municipality and you essentially are the tax collector, and you're dealing with these. Here, we're at more of an arm's length because the province does the collecting. But I've seen the care from people coming in, the complaints, the conversations about the increases more than I have ever seen it before. So while I enjoy the ride of this excess dollars in our investments, it makes me really nervous, the state of the world and the state of the economy and the anger that's coming out from people and my frontline workers having to field that. So I'm very cognizant of the decisions that we make and how that's going to impact them when it comes down to actually charging the constituents. And we are all taxpayers. So just to understand, there's a whole lot of factors playing into reserves and surpluses and the impact on taxation and all of these that we're trying to factor in. But we are paying attention and we're listening and trying to meet the needs of 27 different opinions of what's right and wrong and bring them to some alignment. So hopefully we're doing that. Hopefully we're showing you that through our research that we're going to bring you something that helps give you confidence in what we're doing in transparency. So anyway, sorry, I went on a little bit of a soapbox there. My apologies. I don't really want to at this stage go through policy by policy. What I want to point you to is the very first one, Regional District of Kootenay boundary, is the policy I enjoy the most. I will bring this package back to you to the next Finance Committee meeting with some points of where the things in the policies that I would like us to move forward with. And those of you that would like to go through the material and also bring in some points that you would like to see or talk to us about incorporating, please do. This is a good opportunity to give you guys some time to sift through the information. But overall, like I said, the Kootenay boundary policy is the one I like. It's thorough. It gives lots of parameters. Marnie did up an awesome schedule to start, and it compares each of the ones that we found so far. Director Grenier also had provided some typically, and I do have those, all of that information here as well, to layer into the stuff and the work that we do. But we do certainly follow a process of comparing ourselves to our neighbors. We're always asked about it, and we try to find the most common ones. What I do want is I want to give an opportunity, and I'm going to put Marnie on the spot, is if there's anything, sorry, Marnie, wakey. Is there anything in the research that you did bringing the chart together that you liked or that you thought we should think about or focus on other than what I've already mentioned?
Beyond what you've already mentioned, not really. I think just setting the minimums and maximums for reserves are really helpful. And I think that would enable staff to have that guidance to what
okay. Thanks. And just for Director Stamer, Marnie just stated that she liked to see the minimums and maximums within the policy, within reserves, and it provided good guidance to staff. So are there any questions at this stage on what I brought or what we will discuss next time?
Looks like no.
All right, well, I hope that means that I either gave you enough information or I talked you to sleep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, next item is new business. Any new business? No? Okay. Motion to adjourn. Moved by Director Andy. Thank you.